The morning Karl came home from the war, nobody threw flowers. There were no banners. No music. No crowd standing in the street to welcome him back. There was only his mother standing in the doorway of their small house in a quiet German town, her hands pressed together as if she were still praying, the way she had been praying every night for 4 years. She looked at her son's face and saw that something had changed there, something deep, like a light that had been switched off and had not come back on. She held him without speaking, and he let her, standing stiff as a wooden post, because he had forgotten, somewhere out there in the mud, how to be held. It was November 1918. The First World War had ended. Germany had lost. Karl was 22 years old. He had gone to war believing in glory and come back believing in nothing. His boots were thin. His coat had a hole at the elbow. His friend Stefan had not come back at all. He had gone down in a French field in the spring of 1917, and Karl had not been able to do a single thing about it. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the losing. Not the cold. Not even the hunger. It was the helplessness. The feeling that all of it, 4 years, millions of lives, an entire world torn apart, had added up to nothing. The Germany that Karl returned to was not the Germany he had left. The streets were thin with hungry people. The shops were half empty. His father, who had once managed a small printing business, had closed the doors and was now working whatever small jobs he could find. Money existed, but it bought almost nothing. There was a period, Karl remembered it with something close to disbelief even years later, when people brought wheelbarrows full of paper money to the market just to buy a loaf of bread. He watched his mother count notes by the hundreds and still not have enough for milk. The government that had signed the armistice, the men who had agreed to Germany's defeat, were hated. The peace treaty signed at Versailles in 1919 had taken land from Germany, taken its military strength, and forced the country to accept full blame for the war. It had also demanded payments so large that economists said Germany could not pay them in 100 years. In the beer halls and the street corners and the kitchen tables of Germany, people were furious. And they were looking for someone to explain why. Karl found work in a steel factory. It was hard work, and it paid little, but it kept him busy enough not to think too much. He married a woman named Elsa, who had kind eyes and a practical mind, and they moved into a small apartment with 2 rooms and a window that looked out onto an alley. Their first son, Wilhelm, was born in 1922. Their daughter, Marta, came 2 years later. Karl loved his children with a quiet fierceness that he had no words for. He worked harder. He said less. The 1920s moved in 2 directions at once. In the cities, especially Berlin, there was art and music and a feeling of wild, almost desperate freedom. Young people danced. Writers wrote. Painters painted. Germany was trying to build a new kind of country, a democracy called the Weimar Republic, and for a few years it looked like it might actually work. But underneath the dancing, the ground was shaking. In 1929, the American stock market crashed. The disaster crossed the ocean in weeks. Banks in Germany collapsed. Businesses closed overnight. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. Karl's factory cut hours. His neighbors lost their homes. He saw men he respected, men who had worked their entire lives, standing in lines for soup. He saw children wearing their father's coats because there was nothing else. And then, at night, he heard on the radio a voice that was unlike anything he had heard before. The voice was loud and certain. It was angry, but in a way that felt like a mirror, because it was angry about exactly what Karl was angry about. It spoke about Germany's humiliation. It spoke about the unfairness of Versailles. It spoke about the weakness of the current government and the strength that Germany could have again. The voice promised work. It promised dignity. It promised that Germany would rise. The voice belonged to Adolf Hitler. Karl did not think of himself as a political man. He was a factory worker with 2 children and not enough money and a very tired wife. But in January 1933, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, Karl felt something he had not felt since before the war. He felt hope. He did not stop to examine that feeling. He did not turn it over to look at what was underneath it. He simply felt it, the way a cold man feels the first warmth of a fire, and moved closer. The changes came fast. Faster than anyone expected. Within months, the new government had taken control of the newspapers and the radio. Political parties that opposed Hitler were shut down. People who spoke too loudly against the government disappeared, quietly, with no announcement, and no one asked too many questions about where they had gone. Karl noticed these things the way a man notices a change in the weather. He was aware of it. But he had other things to think about. Because the factory was hiring again. That was the thing that is hard to explain later, when everything is already known. The economy recovered. Roads were built. Unemployment fell. Wilhelm started school and came home proud in a youth uniform, singing songs about Germany's future. The country felt, from the inside, like a machine that had finally been fixed. People were eating again. Karl bought Elsa a new coat. It was the first new piece of clothing either of them had owned in years. She cried when she put it on, and he did not ask her why, because he understood. But things were also happening that Karl chose not to look at directly. In 1935, laws were passed that took rights away from Jewish Germans, people who had lived in Germany their whole lives, whose parents and grandparents had been German. They could no longer work in certain jobs. Their children were removed from schools. Karl's neighbor, a quiet man named Herr Brenner who repaired watches and always nodded politely in the hallway, closed his shop one week and was gone the next. Karl asked no one what had happened to him. No one told him. In November 1938, something happened that Karl could not pretend not to notice. In a single night, across all of Germany, Jewish shops and homes and places of worship were broken into and burned. Glass covered the streets of every city. People were taken away in the middle of the night. Karl walked past broken glass on his way to work the next morning. He walked quickly. He did not stop. Later, he would tell his children that he had not understood what it meant. His daughter Marta, who was 14 that year, never believed him. She had understood. She had stood at the window that night and watched the fires and felt something go cold inside her that never fully warmed again. On the first day of September 1939, Germany entered Poland. The radio called it a defensive action. The newspapers printed headlines about German strength and rightful territory. Wilhelm was 17. He sat at the kitchen table with his eyes bright and his chin up, talking about honor and country, and Karl looked at his son across the table and felt afraid for the first time in years, not of Germany's enemies, but of something he could not name. Something closer. The war went well at first, from where most Germans were standing. Poland fell in less than a month. France, which had humiliated Germany in the last war, surrendered in 6 weeks. German soldiers stood beneath the Eiffel Tower and smiled for photographs. People at home celebrated. Karl celebrated too, though quietly. He was old enough to know that wars have a way of turning. Wilhelm turned 19 in 1941 and received his draft papers that same week. He said goodbye to his family on a gray morning in June. He shook his father's hand and kissed his mother and hugged Marta, who was taller than him now and who told him, quietly so their parents would not hear, to please come back. He laughed and said of course he would come back. He believed it completely. He had no reason not to. He was sent east. Germany had turned its attention to the Soviet Union, the largest country on Earth, stretching from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. The plan was to defeat it quickly, before the winter. The German military command was certain of this. The men in the field were less certain but said nothing, because you did not say nothing when certainty was the order of the day. The letters Wilhelm sent home in the first months were good. He described the landscape, the enormous flatness of it, the strange quality of the light, the birch trees that went on forever. He wrote about his friend Ernst, a mechanic from Bavaria who could fix anything and who told bad jokes and shared his food without being asked. He wrote that he was fine, that they were moving fast, that it would be over soon. Then the letters changed. He stopped describing the landscape. He stopped mentioning Ernst by name. The letters became short, sometimes only a paragraph, with words that felt chosen carefully, like a man picking his way across ice. He wrote that it was cold. He wrote that they were fighting hard. He wrote that he thought about home all the time. He did not write what he was seeing. He could not find the words for it, and even if he could, he was not sure he would want his family to carry those images too. At Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River, the war changed forever. The German army had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, but at Stalingrad it stopped. The Soviet forces held. What followed was not a quick battle. It was months of the most brutal, close-range fighting that the war had produced, not in open fields but inside buildings, inside rooms, sometimes inside the same staircase, one side above and one below, neither able to move. Winter arrived, and with a temperature so far below freezing that the steel of rifles became dangerous to touch with bare hands. The German army was surrounded in November 1942. 300,000 soldiers trapped in a circle of Soviet forces, running out of food, running out of medicine, running out of everything. Hitler ordered them to hold. He sent no real help. He called them heroes. He gave their commander a promotion. He did not let them leave. Ernst was killed on Christmas Day. Wilhelm wrote one sentence about it in his next letter, and then did not mention it again. Karl read that sentence standing in the kitchen and sat down slowly in a chair. Elsa came in and saw his face and put her hand on his shoulder without asking anything, because she already knew. On the second day of February 1943, what remained of the German force at Stalingrad surrendered. Of the 300,000 men who had been surrounded, 91,000 were taken prisoner. Wilhelm was among them. He would not come home for 7 more years. In Germany, the government announced 3 days of national mourning. Hannah, a schoolteacher in Berlin who had believed in the new Germany, who had taught her students about German strength and German pride, sat alone in her apartment that night and looked at the wall for a long time. Something had broken. She could feel it, like a crack running through the floor beneath her feet. She had been telling herself, for years, that the things she was uneasy about were small things. That the good was larger than the uncomfortable parts. That she should trust the leadership, trust the plan, trust the result. She had stopped being able to tell herself that. The war entered its last, terrible phase. Allied planes appeared over German cities at night and did not stop coming. Hamburg burned for days. Dresden turned to fire in February 1945. Karl's factory was bombed, and he carried 3 of his workers out of the rubble with his own hands. One of them did not survive. Karl buried him and went back to work because there was nothing else to do. Marta was 20 years old now. She worked as a nurse. She had seen things that she never spoke of. She moved through her days with a quietness that had nothing to do with peace. In the spring of 1945, everything collapsed at once. Soviet forces crossed into Germany from the east. The government that had promised 1,000 years of German greatness was issuing its last orders to forces that no longer fully existed. Old men and teenage boys were handed weapons and told to hold positions against professional armies. Karl's youngest son, 15 years old, was one of them. Karl found him at a bridge with a weapon he barely knew how to hold and walked him home without saying a word. He did not care, in that moment, about orders or country or anything except the fact that his son was 15 years old and not going to stand on a bridge with a weapon. On the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in an underground shelter beneath Berlin. Germany surrendered 8 days later. Karl stood outside what remained of his building on a morning in May and looked at the sky, which was, despite everything, blue. Somewhere behind him, his wife was making coffee with what little they had left. A Soviet soldier walked past on the other side of the street. He was young, maybe 18, and he looked exhausted in the same way every soldier Karl had ever seen looked exhausted, like a man who needed to sit down somewhere safe and not get up for a very long time. Karl thought about what had happened. He thought about where it had started, not in 1939, and not in 1933, but back in 1918, when he had come home to a broken country and found a voice that told him what he wanted to hear. He thought about the things he had noticed and chosen not to ask about. He thought about Brenner and his watch shop. He thought about the glass on the street that morning in November 1938, and how he had walked faster. He thought about all of it for a long time, standing in the May sunshine. Germany rebuilt slowly. The rubble was cleared, brick by brick. New buildings went up. The economy, impossibly, recovered. Wilhelm came home in 1950, thin and gray before his time, and sat at the kitchen table where he had once talked about honor and country, and said almost nothing at all. His family did not push him. They gave him food and let him be quiet and hoped that, in time, some part of him would come back. Some of it did. Not all of it. Marta became a doctor. She worked in a clinic and was known for being very calm in difficult situations, which people around her admired. She never told them that the calmness was not natural, that it was something she had learned by necessity, built like a wall, because on the other side of it were things she needed to function despite. Hannah taught school for 30 more years. She changed the way she taught history. She made her students ask hard questions. She made them sit with uncomfortable answers. Some parents complained that she was too negative, that she should focus on Germany's achievements and not its failures. She listened politely and changed nothing. There is a memorial in the center of Berlin today, thousands of dark concrete blocks of different heights, standing close together like a forest with no trees, only stone. It sits in the heart of the capital, impossible to miss, impossible to walk past without feeling something. It was built by the descendants of the people who caused the greatest loss of life in human history. They built it themselves, in the center of their own city, and called it a memorial to those who were lost. That act, the building of that memorial, the choosing not to look away, is perhaps the most important thing that came out of everything. Not the rebuilt cities. Not the recovered economy. Not the new government or the new laws. But the decision, made by a whole nation over decades, to face what had happened honestly. To teach it in schools without softening it. To stand in front of those concrete blocks and say, this happened here, because of us, and we will not forget it. Karl lived until 1971. He was a quiet old man who sat in a garden chair in summer and read the newspaper and occasionally fell asleep in the afternoon sun. His grandchildren played around his feet. He loved them fiercely and said little. On some evenings, when the light was a certain way, he would go very still and look at something that was not in the garden. His granddaughter once asked him what he was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am looking at what could have been different. She was 7 years old and did not fully understand. But she remembered it. She remembered it her whole life, the way he said it, slowly, without drama, the way a man states a simple fact that he has lived with for a very long time. That is the story of Germany and its war. Not of monsters. Not of heroes. But of ordinary people, making ordinary choices, in a world that had already gone very wrong, and the long, unfinished work of understanding how it happened, so that it does not happen again.